Hello, guys. This is Mr. Cole. Today we are going to be going over more on our modern American history, so 1970s till today, the last 50 years. Last time, before spring break, we talked about the environmental movement, and that also dealt with President Nixon's presidency and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Today, we're going to look at kind of the highlights of Nixon's presidency. Basically, we're going to follow president by president now, all the way up till basically today. So with that, today's focus will be on our 37th president, Richard Nixon. Now, he served from 1969 to 1974. Now, that is a 5-year time, so you might be sitting there going, that's kind of weird. Why only 5 years? We will get to that. Unfortunately, the section title I named this one is probably Nixon's most famous line, which is, "I am not a crook." And we will talk about what Nixon got involved in and why, unfortunately, his presidency was brought down by some really, really massive scandals. But before we should do that, we should look at Nixon's presidency. So first, we've actually been dealing with Nixon a lot more than I think you realize. So we already learned about Nixon in the Vietnam War, essentially the president that got America's involvement in Vietnam over, who was able to get the peace agreement signed to end our involvement in Vietnam. We talked about the EPA as well. So Nixon already has done quite a bit in just his first couple of years as president. Now, Nixon approached the Cold War after the Vietnam War was over. Nixon decided to approach the Cold War a lot differently than the presidents before him had. The presidents before him had followed the Truman Doctrine, the idea that we would stop and prevent communism from spreading anywhere in the world. Nixon says we need to take a more realistic approach and realize that, you know what, if Vietnam becomes communist, is it really that big of a deal, right? Yeah, we should try and prevent it from spreading all over the place, but let's be realistic about which countries we really need to be worried about and which countries we can kind of let go. And so you're going to see Nixon not be ready to jump to war every 3 seconds like the other 20 years of presidents had been doing. He's going to say, let's focus on the countries that are important and the countries that are smaller, who really worries about them. So with this, Nixon's policy is going to begin an era of what we call détente with the Soviet Union. This is an easing of tensions. Détente's like a cooling down. Nixon is going to start cooling down our tensions with the communist world. He will become the first president to visit the Soviet Union. He will become the first president to visit China, and realizes that the United States and the Soviets don't need to go toe-to-toe with each other every single second of every single day. That we can be flexible in dealing with communism. That we can allow communism to exist under certain terms. And so Nixon's presidency really brings on kind of a warming up of the two nations, and the idea that no longer are we going to go to the all-out threat of nuclear war against each other. Most famously, Nixon's visit to China was an international moment. No American president had ever visited China, especially as a communist country. And so it showed that Nixon was willing to work with the communist world, and that maybe the world wasn't going to turn to World War III right away. Along with that, Nixon was able to get the very first nuclear arms treaty signed between the United States and Soviet Union. It's called the SALT I treaties. It limited the number of nuclear missiles. Now, when we talk about limiting, I mean, we're still limiting down to like 50,000 nuclear warheads or something crazy like that. So it was not a huge limit, but it still is a start. The fact that the United States and Soviet Union can sit down at the same table together and agree to begin reducing our nuclear weapons with each other shows the Cold War is hopefully starting to come to an end. And one of the huge successes of Nixon. Now, Nixon is our first Republican president in a long time. We had only had Dwight Eisenhower, so since the Great Depression in the 1930s, for about the 30, 40 years, there had only been about 8 years of Republican presidents. We had a pretty strong run of Democrats. So Nixon is going to come in with a modern conservative idea of beginning to limit some of the New Deal and the Great Society programs of the Democrats that had really ballooned the size of government. Things like Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps and housing projects. Nixon is going to start rolling those back. And Nixon is going to believe that the federal government has gotten too large. It's gotten too big. And so he is going to have a plan of starting to reduce that power, much like conservatives today have, right? Conservatives today preach small government, more local and state decisions. A less powerful national government is going to be Nixon's big policy. Now, Nixon was honestly on a run of being one of our better presidents in our nation's history. And unfortunately, Nixon's own crimes and his own decisions unfortunately brought his presidency crashing down in a famous event that we now call Watergate. Watergate is such a fundamental change in American society. Now, any scandal ever has the word gate attached to it. If for football fans, you may know about the New England Patriots and Deflategate, that they deflated the footballs, or Spygate, that they're spying on people. President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, people called it Benghazi Gate. Anytime there's a scandal, people put the word gate at the end. And it comes from this event that Richard Nixon. Now, I'm going to be really quick on this because your homework's going to be to look at this. But Watergate is ultimately the scandal that led to President Nixon's resignation from the presidency, the only president in our nation's history to resign from office. It dealt with the 1972 election. As Richard Nixon was coming up for re-election, members of the Committee to Re-elect the President, an organization whose goal it was to get Nixon reelected, broke into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. So Watergate is actually a hotel. It is actually still there. I've actually driven by it when I've been in D.C. So it's the name of the hotel and the office complex that goes around with it. The Democrats had their party headquarters there. Well, on a night in 1972, 5 men broke into the Watergate Hotel and were caught by police. They had tens of thousands of dollars on them. They had all sorts of spying equipment on them. And the idea was they were trying to spy and get information from the Democrats. Originally, not much was linked to Nixon. I mean, obviously everybody knew that these guys were definitely Republicans who supported Nixon, but there was originally no evidence that Nixon had any idea that this happened or had anything to say about it. However, as more pressure gets put on these, burglars, eventually they start to admit that members of Nixon's cabinet, members of Nixon's, team in the White House, had basically been paying them to stay quiet about it. And that's when the story breaks like crazy. Nixon famously, I won't play it for you because I'll respect your time. Nixon famously comes up on a podium, says, the American people has a right to know if their president is a crook. Well, I am not a crook, and everything I've done in my life is, I've won for myself. Now, the really sad part is that Nixon didn't even need these guys. Nixon actually won the 1972 election before all the huge news about it broke. He won it, I believe, carried 48 of the 50 states, something crazy. I mean, he was absolute blowout that he did not need. Now, as more and more investigation goes into it, people start to find connections between members of Nixon's White House and these men. Eventually, members of Nixon's White House break from him and testify in front of Congress that Nixon himself was in the room and knew about the cover-up that happened, and that there was a recording device. And on the recording device, it clearly showed that Nixon knew that the cover-up was going to happen, that these men were going to be paid off to stay quiet about who sent them. And ultimately, Richard Nixon decides that rather than face impeachment, that he would resign as president of the United States, becoming the first president to ever resign the office. And with that, step away from the presidency. This is the final shot of him entering Marine One, the helicopter, on the White House lawn after his resignation as he goes back home, stepping away from office. Now, the president that would follow him would be someone who also did not have any idea about this going on. Gerald Ford, his vice president, would become the new president. Now, Gerald Ford has the legacy of being the only president never to be elected. Gerald Ford was appointed by Richard Nixon when Nixon's vice president got in trouble. And so Ford was appointed by Nixon and then ultimately takes over as president upon Nixon's resignation. And so with that, we will learn about the Ford presidency later on. All right, guys, see ya.